Today's stories are about the legendary Goatman. According to legend, the Goatman is half goat, half man, and used to be a human scientist who experimented on goats. A crazy story, yeah, but people have allegedly seen him. So I'll leave it up to you to decide what you believe. Enjoy these stories, and if you want your story in a future episode, send it to me at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear some stories about the Dogman, being home alone, and being lost in the woods. Now, let's begin. The Lonely Man. From Carbon. I live in Maryland. I've lived here my whole 25-year-old life. Back in high school, I was a part of my track and field team. Running was and still is one of the few things I'm good at. As you'll see from my story, though, running was what got me into this mess, and yet it also got me out of it, or at least away from it, for the night. After high school, my parents let me move into their country rent property, under the condition that I either further my studies by attending college or remaining employed full-time. They even offered to let me take over payments for the house if I had the monthly income to do it, meaning I had the chance to make it my own home one day. I was lucky for this. Not too many kids out of high school had the opportunity to be homeowners out of the gate. I just needed to find a well-paying job. I wasn't really interested in going to college, honestly. I never really figured out what I wanted to do or be. So I thought I'd go to college one day when I was ready and had stable finances. My parents' rent house was located down a long dirt road through miles of pine and oak trees. It creeped out a lot of my friends that I had over, but I never really thought of the place as creepy at first. To me, it was really serene. Waking up for a morning jog and hearing nothing but birds and bugs, it really got me pumped for the day. And coming home at night for a brisk run after dark was almost better. Now, a week or so after moving in and keeping my tradition of running alive, I began to take notice that I wasn't so alone out there. I would do my runs along the dirt road, 2 miles in and 2 miles back, according to my Fitbit. The morning run was always solitary. I didn't seem to have a neighbor for miles, so I never saw any other walkers or cars passing by. But some nights were different. On occasion, on the way back home, I would sometimes pass by a man in a hood and a badly bent back. He'd be walking along the opposite side of the road, going the other way. The first few times I passed him, I would nod or wave, but I never received anything in response. I didn't mind. I took the hint. Some folks just don't want to be bothered. After about a week, I simply gave up the communication. Even so, I continued to keep an eye on him every time I saw him. Out there, almost alone, but always trying to keep myself occupied, it gave me something interesting to do. Observing him, trying to learn as much about him with the fleeting seconds I had with him those nights. I gathered some things about him. For one, he seemed to have a limp, and it almost seemed like it got worse every time I saw him. Also, I believe he carried something under his cloak. I thought it was a walking stick or something, but I never saw or heard it hit the ground. About a month into living at the place, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of screaming coming from the woods. For a moment, I assumed it was one of those weird waking dream things. But after I rubbed my eyes and looked around, I heard it again. I stood up and faced my window, peering out. It was coming from the direction of the dirt road, for sure. A woman's scream. I threw on my loafers and ran outside. For a while there, I thought that would be the last of it. I didn't hear the sound again until I was reaching for the doorknob to head back inside. The moment I heard it from behind me, chills crept over my skin like freezing, biting ocean water. I was very sure then it was a woman's scream. Grabbing my cell phone, I dialed the police and reported what I'd heard. Within the next couple of hours, a police cruiser drove down the dirt road and into my driveway slowly. An officer stepped out while another officer remained in the car. The one that approached me verified that I was the one who reported the sound. Then he let me know that they would drive up and down the road for a while in case they saw anything, but so far there was nothing out of the ordinary. I stayed a couple of hours, but the police didn't come by again. I was told by the operator earlier that the region did have the occasional bobcat, and reports of strange screams often ended up being bobcat cries. As I didn't know any better, I left it at that. Over the next month, I managed to land myself a job at a local but well-to-do tech shop. Because it was local, they didn't require a degree. They had me put together a computer, then solve a list of 20 different common problems with a different computer. I passed, and they gave me the job with a guaranteed full-time position and $3 raise after 6 months. That meant I'd be 6 months away from taking over payments for the house. I was incredibly excited, and it meant that I'd be able to quit the fast food job I'd been working. A few weeks later, everything seemed to be going well. My runs were as enjoyable as ever. Better money was already coming in, but to be honest, I was starting to feel a bit lonely out there. I'd been seeing the hooded man on the road as usual, still limping, still carrying something around underneath that old tattered cloak. After the screaming incident, I did feel a bit wary of the man, but that had long since passed. In fact, I'd begun to feel more and more, sorry for the guy. If I was lonely after a couple of months out here, he must have been well beyond lonesome. And the way he limped worse and worse over the weeks, I figured at one point that maybe, since he was kind of a neighbor to me, I'd keep him company one night. Sure, he had never replied to me, but that was when I'd had headphones in, and I was moving at a quicker pace. One night, as I was jogging back from the 2-mile mark, I spotted his disheveled form approaching steadily in the distance. The full moon allowed me to see a bit further than usual. I slowed down to a walk and I caught my breath. I thought about what I was going to say. Just as he was stumbling past, I breathed in and spoke to him. Hey there. Would you mind some company? For the first time since the first night I saw him, he reacted. The man stopped in his tracks. I turned to face him and approached his closest side. He began to walk again, and I walked next to him. I noticed his breathing was deep and slow, even a bit hoarse. More than ever, I was wondering why the guy so frequently took walks out here, what with the limp and trouble breathing and all that. So I see you around here from time to time on my runs. I tried to start a conversation. Do you, live nearby? I'm new around here myself. I actually didn't think I had any neighbors. Suddenly, I heard his limping gait stop. I looked over at him. He seemed to have stopped breathing. Then I heard a metallic clang on the rocks below him. Looking down, something smooth and silvery had hit the ground. It looked like an axe head. I swallowed hard and tried not to freak out. He was probably out here chopping wood, I guessed. Then something happened that I didn't expect. The man sighed, standing up to his full height. I personally stand at just about 6 feet tall, so I was surprised when he stood to my height. But my breathing stopped too, as he continued to stand to a taller and taller height. That bent back of his straightened entirely, and the cloak that had nearly dragged the ground before was now at waist height. Legs that should have belonged to an old man were instead backwards bent limbs ending in something that wasn't feet. At his side, in his massive hand, was certainly a wood-cutting axe, sheening in the light of the full moon. I didn't notice that I had fallen onto my butt, staring up at this neighbor of mine. His hood had dipped backward a bit, and a forward-facing snout poked through the dark. I could see it grinding its teeth, each of them thick and ivory and square. These features reminded me of a goat more than anything else. It stood still, a mist forming in front of its mouth as it breathed perfectly well and silently, as if it was waiting for me to react now. And after finding my sanity, I pulled myself off the ground and ran faster than I ever had before. I had another 1.5 miles to go or so, and I ran the full way, only stopping when I was able to collapse on my own couch. After that experience, I ran only in the morning, and only after a week without running at all, terrified that I would see the hooded figure again. I would hear more screaming the odd day of the months as they went on, and eventually I was able to have the house's loan signed over to me. The moment should have been happy, but I couldn't help but feel as if I had trapped myself in my new forested hell with something that isn't human. To this day, I pray that I don't see another cloaked figure on that dirt road. My Mom Touched the Goatman, from Annie Oakley, 1976. My mother far from lived a mundane life. Being born of migrant parents, she was always on the move. Of all the places my mom lived, she regretted 2. One was in Orange County, California, and this is the reason why. She was about 6 at the time, and her parents, older brother, and baby sister lived in a hotel. They weren't allowed to enter the front because one of the owners who ran the place didn't like the way the family looked. So my mom's family was made to use an alley door, which was in a very poorly lit and spooky-looking alleyway. My mom bypassed this by slipping in an open window to the room her family was staying in. She got away with this for a while. Now, there was this big dog one of the neighbors had that loved all the children, but he didn't like my mom. Every time she tried to get near the dog, he would bare his teeth and growl at her. There didn't seem to be any reason why the dog should zone in on my mom to hate, since she never showed any sign of aggression to the creature. So my mom would just stay away. One faithful day, her parents sent my mom out for a grocery errand. Of course, my mom, being who she was, slid out the window, but it was this time her own mom bellowed out, "Stop that! Use the door!" My mom just shrugged this off. After all, she was already out, so what did it matter? So she went to get the groceries and headed home. It had just become dusk, and Mom realized that her window entrance was closed shut and locked. Her fear began to peak. She didn't want to walk the 17 feet to the door she could barely see, so she rapped on the panel only to have her mom yell, "Use the door!" What could my mom do? If she kept defying her mother, it could end in a punishment, so she had to brave this dark alleyway. She had to take baby steps because 1, the alleyway sidewalk was in disrepair, and 2, it was that dark. She got about 10 feet in when she heard deep breathing, breaths that were not her own. She stopped, eyes wide, but couldn't see anything. She felt a tingling in her body that she wasn't alone. Braving it, she took a few more steps, only to now hear a low growl. She shivered and convinced herself it had to be that dog, the one that didn't like her. She kept telling herself she wasn't afraid as she shakily reached out her hand, feeling coarse fur, sighing, "Hey, doggy." The growl that came out of this creature did not sound like any dog, but much more sinister. As the thing huffed smelly breath at her, the growl almost sounded like it said, "You." My mom then let out one blood-curdling scream that would chill the blood of demons. Then she heard what she described as horse-like hooves running off. Her father opened the door half-panicked and asked, "Dolly, what happened?" My mom looked around. The smell of urine and wet fur hung light in the air, but other than that, there in that alley was only her and her dad. She sighed. "I guess I just, scared myself." Her dad shook his head and replied, "Well, come on in, okay?" My mom gladly did. From then on, she always made sure it was broad daylight before going in that alleyway again, and I think my mom's scream scared the Goatman. Security Guard Blues from 9 Iron. For me, the toughest part about being a security guard has been the boringness. Going hours upon hours between rounds, trying to figure out ways to pass the time. I would work from 10 o'clock to 6:30 a.m., watching over an old warehouse that might cave in at any second, by the looks of it. The place was a storage building for paper products. If it sounds boring already, multiply that by 2 and you've got the picture. Officially, we security guards weren't even allowed to look at our phones while on duty, but none of us obeyed the rule. While occasionally glancing at the monitors or at the clock to see if it was time for my rounds, I'd place my phone on the counter and watch YouTube videos. The longer the video, the better. I found it best to just find a long Let's Play with some at least mildly entertaining Let's Player and let it go for hours. Anyway, this story happened on one specific night. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed my job. If the worst part of my job is it being boring, then I'd consider that a blessing. But that night in particular had me reconsidering my employment for some time. It was 1:35 a.m., a long ways away from sunup. When I glanced at the clock, it was 5 minutes past when I was supposed to take my second round of the night. I sighed and got out of my chair, exiting the small mobile building with my torch in hand. Now, I never did like where they decided to place the security building. You exit through the door and you're met with woods on both sides, with the warehouse in front and a paved gated road to the left along the wood line. Darkness plus woods will always give me the creeps. I just can't help it. I made my way away from the security building, shining the light along the side wall of the warehouse. From there, I made my way to the side entry door. Using my set of keys, I began to unlock it, but I immediately heard something in the woods behind me. Chills literally flew up my neck as I turned around in an instant and shone the light left and right and in front of me. All I saw was a trembling branch. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. "Hey, this is private property," I yelled out. Someone had to have moved that branch. All the way out here, it was probably kids old enough to drive, but not old enough to be mature enough to think that pranking someone was a silly idea. If that wasn't the reason, then surely any thieves would realize paper products weren't exactly the most lucrative items to steal. I stood there for at least a minute, motionless, thinking that if I was quiet enough, then the culprit might reveal themselves. But nothing happened. I reluctantly turned around, finishing unlocking the door. Once I finally had it unlocked, I opened it and entered faster than usual. My creepiness had escalated thanks to that sound. The building interior was mostly empty. I simply had to shine the light from corner to corner, slowly checking and making sure nothing was missing, out of place, or human. I did so, the light beam gliding along the walls as everything appeared fine, except for how shaky my hand had become. Once that was clear, I made my way upstairs where the manager's office was, including the archives. That was arguably the more important area to check, as that's where the planning was done and the keys and paperwork were held. I climbed the steps, and about halfway up I heard something on the wall just to my right that nearly made me fall back down the steps. A massive bang reverberated throughout the building, originating from my exact position by the wall. Instead of turning to face the wall, I held tightly to the rails, grabbing at my chest afterwards. My heart very much pounded and ached with fright. When my heart and mind both calmed down, I gulped and thought about the situation. Whatever hit the building had hit the wall about 12 feet up. As I said, I'd been halfway up the steps. The wall had been hit right where I'd been from the outside. Naturally, my thought, or rather my hope, was that it had been a fallen branch. But there hadn't been any wind that night, and there wasn't enough to make that much of a difference anyway. I needed to head outside to see what it was, to not only clear my mind, but also because it was part of my job. Anything out of the ordinary would need to be investigated, possibly reported, and recorded. I was terrified to step outside, though. At this point, I figured there was someone out there, or some sort of animal, especially after that first sound in the moving branch. I shook it off and reminded myself that this was my job. I headed down the steps and proceeded out of the side entry door. I would need to follow the outside wall, then round the corner to arrive at the back wall, where I'd been at on the inside. I walked calmly, shining the light straight, but making sure I was well aware of all the possible noises around me. Just before I rounded the corner, I heard the weirdest sound. A sort of chanting grunt that sounded repeatedly, monotone and in a loop. It was coming from beyond that corner. My whole body tensed up as I approached. I swear a cold sweat had developed on my forehead. I decided I would do it all at once, jump around the corner, and shine my light on the perpetrator while reaching to my side, pretending I had a weapon when I was actually entirely unarmed and defenseless. 1, 2, 3. I jumped around the corner. The back wall was clear. The forest beside it was still, but the sounds continued. It took me a moment, but I soon realized it was coming from the woods, which were now at my right and only a few yards away. I breathed in deeply, about to roll my eyes at the constant stress of the night, when I focused my eyes on something in the woodline. Legs. Massive legs that went up to my chest and bent at a weird angle. They were covered in fur. I followed them upward to see an oddly small torso, bony and also covered in fur. The arms attached to it were extremely thin and reaching up into the tree next to it. At first I thought I had interrupted the creature climbing up into the tree, but as I got a good look at its face and the way it was moving, it was clear it had been climbing down the tree as if it had been waiting for me. When I saw the face, I gasped. It was a mess of disgusting, greasy, matted hair or beard with 2 black beady eyes set way back in its skull. At the sides of its head were curled horns similar to that of a ram, though its snout reminded me more of a goat. Now my instincts took over. You can laugh or roll your eyes at what I did next, but I can tell you with all honesty that this is how my body decided to react. I screamed, my arm whirling back. Then I chunked my heavy black flashlight or torch at the thing, causing it to flinch just slowly enough that the metal flashlight hit it in the shoulder. It grunted as I ran like a scared little boy all the way back to the security building. I watched the monitors, which unfortunately did not record hardly any portions of the woodline. The cameras were set primarily on the warehouse. And this creature, using the forest as cover, moved to the back of the security building, still grunting while beginning to shove on the side of it, causing the thing to rock back and forth. This continued for 5 minutes or so, as I had to quite literally remind myself to breathe in my panic. When it stopped, I stayed put and quiet until morning, at which the next guy opened the door to the security building, seeing me halfway on the floor and horrified. I explained that I'd nearly been attacked by some animal, and I let them know to watch out for something big in those woods, but I kept the rest of the details to myself. I continued to work at that job since then, but not one time after that did I encounter anything even remotely similar. To this day, I pray that everything that I experienced was just a very vivid and bad dream or night terror or something, but I know that that's denial on my part. Wish me luck, everyone. I still work here. And just as a note, don't take your boring job for granted. The Standing Goat, from Jacobs. My friend, let's call him Fred, used to work as a ballpark mower. He'd show up once a week at the ballpark during baseball season, early in the morning before sunrise, and cut the grass. It wasn't a major league ballpark or anything, just what the kids used for their leagues. Anyway, we would hang out at his place playing video games, and after a beer or two, he would always talk about how much he missed the job. And he definitely missed that old zero-turn mower he could work with. He never could afford to buy one for himself, though. On one occasion, after Fred had a few more beers than usual, he suddenly paused our co-op session of Halo and breathed for a moment. Then he said something kinda eerie. Want to know the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me? Being his friend, and a bit of a weirdo myself, I obviously and quickly answered with a yes. This is what he said. I'll tell it from his point of view. So I used to cut those ball fields for the city. I've told you that a dozen times before, I'm sure, but the creepiest thing I ever saw happened one early morning before the sun came up, while cutting the northern diamond. I had the mower going, it was loud as usual, couldn't even hear myself think. So I never did hear the thing, not until I shut the mower off to refill the gas and check the oil. I knelt down pouring the gas in the mower when I suddenly heard this weird sound. It was like a chugging sound, like a car motor mixed with a deer call. Strangest thing I ever heard. I thought to myself, that's weird, and it sounded close too. I turned my head to the left where this hill led down into a ditch, and there I saw it. You'll never believe it when I say it, but I ain't lying. It was standing on the other side of the fence, on that hill. Now, you know that thing from the old Hercules Disney cartoon? The Danny DeVito goat thing? Imagine that, but instead of being short and fat, this thing was like a thin druggie, taller than either of us too. It had these big, straight, pointed horns going backward from its head, with eyes that seemed to reflect yellow. Its teeth were bared and nearly sparklingly white. It was just standing there, goat legs, human torso, goat head, all that. It was just watching me, like it was mad that I had just cut up the grass it wanted to eat. I stood up and stared back at it. After a few jarring minutes, it walked away and disappeared over the hill. I never did see it again. That was my friend Fred's quick and pretty creepy experience. I've always trusted the guy. I can't think of one time he's ever lied to me, and I believe it wholeheartedly. Sometimes the creepiest and most unexplained things in existence are just a head turn away. Be careful out there.